Okay, class, we're going to be talking about body cavities right now. Okay, now all of our organs in the body are contained within different body cavities. And these body cavities are like little containers or big containers that are going to protect our organs from different types of accidental shocks. And they permit changes in size and shape of the internal organs. They may increase in size. So let's take a look at these cavities. So here's anterior, we know what that means, and back here is posterior. In the anterior portion, we have a thoracic cavity and we have an abdominal pelvic cavity. Those are the two main cavities in the anterior. But in the thoracic cavity, we'll say there's two cavities within, one for the lungs and one for the heart. So the one for the lungs is called the pleural cavity, and the one for the heart is called the pericardial cavity. Then we have this muscle right here called the diaphragm. The diaphragm is going to separate the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity. Okay. The biggie here, within this peritoneal cavity, you can have all your digestive organs here, the stomach, the intestines, the kidneys. Okay, so the peritoneum, you're going to hear peritoneum, pericardial, and pleural. You're going to be hearing that. And within the pleural cavity, there's going to be two layers. Within the pericardial cavity, there's going to be two layers. Within the peritoneal cavity, there's going to be two layers. Always two layers. One of the layers is called visceral, and the other is called parietal. So there's always two layers, a visceral and a parietal layer. So there's a visceral pericardium, there's a parietal pericardium, there's a visceral pleura, a parietal pleura, there's a visceral peritoneum, and a parietal peritoneum. I'll show you what those look like. On the posterior side, there's this cranial cavity for the brain. And then we have this spinal cavity back here for the spinal cord and for cerebral spinal fluid and everything else that flows back here, the meninges that protect the brain and the meninges that protect the spinal cord. That's in the posterior section. Okay, so here, this is called the cranial cavity. This is called the vertebral cavity. This right here, that's the pleural cavity. And this one here is the peritoneal or abdominal pelvic. Okay. So when we look at posterior, remember this is dorsal. We look at anterior, that's the same as ventral. So now it goes to a drag and drop. Under dorsal cavity, we have the cranial cavity for the skull and the brain, the vertebral cavity for the spinal cord, and the meninges. So all of these things are found in the back. In the front, in the ventral, you got the abdominal cavity, we have the diaphragm, we have the lungs, and the mediastinum. The mediastinum is a region between the lungs. It's between the lungs, the spinal column, and the sternum. So between the lungs, but in front of the spinal column, but behind the sternum, That's the mediastinum. Okay, now remember I said that whether we are talking about the heart or the lungs or the digestive tract, there's always going to be two layers protecting the heart, protecting the lungs, and the digestive tract. One of those layers is a visceral layer, and the other layer is a parietal layer. So if we were to take a balloon and I'm pushing my fist into the balloon, the layer that's contacting my fist, which would be any organ, whether it's the heart, the lungs, the stomach, the intestines, that's called the visceral layer. The part of the balloon that's on the other side, that's called a parietal layer. So here's the heart, which would be equivalent to my fist. This would be the balloon. When the heart fits into that, there's a visceral pericardium going around the heart, and there's a parietal pericardium going around the heart. The inner part of the balloon is the cavity. It's called the pericardial cavity that has fluid. Okay? So there's the visceral layer that covers the organ and the parietal layer that's going to line the body wall. So when we look at both the lungs and the heart, if we look at the lungs first, remember with the lung, we always see the word pleura. So the layer that's mostly on the inside that comes into contact with the organ is the visceral pleura. The one that's all the way on the outside is the parietal pleura. And the layer in between is the pleural cavity. Same concept applies to the heart. There's a visceral pericardium, a parietal pericardium, and in the middle, the pericardial cavity. Same concept. Now we're just looking at isolating one. So here's the heart. We're looking at the inner lining of it. So that's the visceral pericardium. If it pointed to this one, then that would be the parietal pericardium. When we talk about the abdominopelvic area, this is when we talk about the peritoneum. But again, you see there's a visceral and a parietal layer. The parietal lines the internal body wall. The visceral layer, the viscera is the organ, it covers the organ. So from a sagittal view, this is a sagittal view, a sagittal plane, we can see the liver, I can see the stomach, I can see the intestines, I can see the kidney, I can see the pancreas. So all of this blue, this is lining the body cavity. So that's the parietal peritoneum. Parietal peritoneum. If it was the visceral peritoneum, then I'd be outlining like just this, the liver itself. Okay. All right, that's the end.